I will introduce Sandy Stone, who is going to introduce our guest speaker today. Sandy Stone is our Vice President of Programs.
Thank you, and what a wonderful turnout, Dan. You're obviously excited about your topic today. So, thanks for joining us. Yes, Dr. Daniel Wegener is going to talk to us today. Woke, how did a virtue become a weapon? Dr. Wegener is an educator, retired educator, administrator. He lived and worked in Central America for 10 years and in Arizona for 30 years. He also served as a non-governmental organization representative to the United Nations in New York. And with that, I turn the mic over to Mr. Wegener. We'll get feedback, I think.
Thank you very much for the introduction. It was a very accurate introduction because, after all, I wrote it myself, right? So Sandy doesn't get credit for that, just the delivery. It's a pleasure to respond to this invitation. I've spoken many times and see a lot of familiar faces with the Green Valley Forum Club. What's different about this is I know more about the audience than I do at the Forum Club. So I always start with a certain amount of trepidation when I'm in a mixed group, quote unquote, not knowing for sure how people are going to react. But today I think I have a pretty good chance of nailing it. So I appreciate the pre-selection of the audience. It's very, very helpful. Before we get into the topic per se, I want to just clarify something that can lead to confusion, and that is that language evolves naturally. I'm a former English teacher, and English teachers suffer a lot in the modern world because English is suffering mightily. I don't know if you've noticed that, but apostrophes appear where they shouldn't be, and words are used in ways that make no sense to me. I mean, there's a lot of insanity, in my opinion, about what's happening to the English language. But historically, that's the nature of language itself. It evolves, it changes, it absorbs, it borrows, it steals. And what we're going to talk about today is a part of the natural evolution of language, but it takes a different twist in the political climate that we live in. So that's why I want to acknowledge that language is not subject to preservation, per se, but at the same time, I think it's important for us as citizens and as voters to know what's happening to certain aspects of language in the media age. And that's really what drew my attention to this topic, and one that I think is really important. Woke, as a vocabulary word, has been around for over 100 years. And in fact, by the dictionary definition, much longer than that, hundreds of years. Because woke is a part of the verb awake or awaken. So you don't use that word very often in that context, but that's originally what it meant. So I awoke yesterday to the sound of my neighbor's dog barking, and I was a little bit annoyed. So woke has that very classic, if you want to think of it that way, definition as it relates to being awake as in not asleep. So it has a literal definition, not that commonly used. In the 40s, going back to the 1940s, woke was used in African American language. And it had to do with the idea of just staying awake, staying alert, being aware of what's happening around you. In 1962, when language was changing very rapidly with new slang and new terms, if you were around at that time, I think most of you may have been, woke meant you dig it. If you said that to a teenager nowadays, they have no idea what you're talking about. But I think we would know what it meant to dig something, to dig it. And so it had that connotation. From the 40s on, and probably prior to the 40s, who knows how far back, but certainly in the mid-20th century and beyond, woke also was a part of the talk. If you follow race relations and racial issues, you're probably aware of the importance of parents of African American children and youth delivering them the talk. It was an act of self-preservation. When you get stopped by a policeman, what do you do? What do you avoid doing? Keeping your hands in the air, telling the officer what you're going to do before you do it, not explaining after. It was literally a matter of helping your children survive. So woke was a part of that conversation that parents had to try to protect as much as they could the actual lives of their children. So in that context, woke was to be alert, to be aware of your surroundings, to be conscious of how other people see you, how they perceive you, what they might misperceive about you. But as we get into the late 20th century, the 60s and beyond, woke took on a not so subtle change in how it was used and what it meant to people. And it became associated with injustice, being aware of injustices. As a part of the civil rights movement and all the upheaval that our society went through in the 60s and 70s, it became more and more important for people like you to be conscious about injustices. What was going on in the society, domestically, but of course internationally. It was also a very important time in our nation's history to be aware about what was happening globally in regards to justice and injustice. So you can see that woke has evolved like many words in the English language. And sometimes I stop and think, my grandson is graduating from high school this month, and it's a really challenging thing for me to try to put my head in his world. It just doesn't make a lot of sense to me. And I'm sure the same is true for him, trying to understand some of the things I say. But some examples of words that have radically changed in our lifetime. When we were young, surfing had something to do with the ocean, right? And now surfing has absolutely nothing to do with water. It means something entirely different. My mother-in-law continued in the 60s and 70s to use the word gay the way her parents did. And we tried to say, that's not really what gay means anymore. She says, well, I don't know why. Text used to be a noun. And now it is a verb, right? How did that happen? Putting you plus two would not have made any sense 20 years ago, would it? What does you and two have to do with each other? Absolutely nothing. And Uber used to be a German word for what? Over or excessive or extreme. Not anymore. And by the way, Uber, if you haven't noticed, parts of speech as a concept has nothing to do with how English is used anymore, if you haven't noticed that. For example, Uber is both a noun and a verb. It used to be an adjective. Deep fake. How did those two get put together? But I'm sure you've read a lot about how dangerous the idea of deep fake has become, where using technology you can put a video online of a person saying things that in real life that person would never think of saying. And it's almost impossible to tell the difference. So I don't know if there's a shallow fake and a deep fake or just a deep fake. But anyway, that's a real thing. One of my favorites, which is fairly new, is Riz. Anybody here consider themselves to have Riz? Too old for that. Riz refers to the ability to attract people that are attracted to you. It's a derivative of charisma. Never mind spelling, right? There's no Z in charisma, but it doesn't matter because Riz is R-I-Z-Z. Go figure. So keep up with what's going on with language in terms of understanding, meaning, expression, and how we communicate with each other. And it seems that the pace of change, like everything else, is accelerating. So keeping up with words and vocabulary and concepts is pretty important. And woke is an example of a challenge to keep up with what it means and what it doesn't mean. So in the early 2000s, which already seems like a long time ago to me, woke was defined as heightened awareness of social and political issues, inequalities, discrimination, social justice, gender, sexuality, inequality, racism, and oppression. So that poor four-letter word carries an awful lot of weight, doesn't it? I mean, this is what it meant in the early 2000s, before it became politicized, which we're going to discuss in some detail. But if you add up all of those troublesome issues, if you want to think of it that way, it's really consciousness of the world around. So in the early 2000s, that's why I started, the title is How Did a Virtue Become a Weapon? Because in my world, in my mind, being conscious of the world around you is a virtue. It's a good thing. What's the opposite of consciousness? Unconsciousness, not conscious, not aware, which in my mind goes to not caring. Not only just not knowing or not noticing, but not caring about what's going on in the world. And that's not how we were raised in the 60s, was it? It was just the opposite. As we go through the decade of the aughts and the teens in this century, that idea of becoming more conscious of the world around you got confused with being politically correct. Is that the same thing? Not really. And politically correct is far from a virtue in most people's minds. Politically correct has become a stand-in for oppression, for criticism, for cancel culture, for taking things away from people. I don't know about you, but I don't hear too much about political correctness anymore because we've moved on to other terms. But the anxiety associated with being politically correct imposed on people still exists under the title of woke. Because unfortunately, woke has been equated in some people's language with a movement that is trying to change the world, change people, change your opinion, change your behavior. And I don't know, how do you go from consciousness of something to political pressure? I mean, those are really very different things. But it's been confused in many, many ways with a movement or a plot to take over public discourse or public opinion. One of the reasons that woke has become troublesome for a lot of people, separate from the weaponization, is because corporations have a way of jumping on the bandwagon and using concepts, trends, ideas to promote commerce. And woke also fits in that category. I'm not a beer drinker, but I've noticed that the whole thing about Budweiser being too woke got to be a big deal. I mean, how do you go from social consciousness to not buying beer? It's a strange world we live in. But a lot of research has been done about public opinion and public discourse as it relates to this term. And one of the unfortunate consequences of the overuse of woke is that for some people it's been equated with what's known by sociologists and linguists as performative nature. So corporations and some individuals and some politicians have adopted the language and the term to project themselves or itself as superior. So even though that wasn't the intent or the use early on, when it becomes politicized and commercialized, then woke takes on a negative connotation for many people. So it became a badge of courage, a badge of being superior as it related to the aesthetics of social justice without genuinely engaging in meaningful actions to address the underlying issues. So it became trendy to be woke if you wanted to be perceived as a progressive, superior person. Whether you really did anything like signing petitions or being an activist or being an active citizen, that was kind of immaterial for a lot of people. As long as I'm perceived as being woke. And can you see how that plays into politicians and campaigns? And we've seen that over and over again, how a candidate will proclaim a belief in X, Y, or Z, but vote in a different way. Or to take money from different sources, that contradict completely what they give lip service to. So if woke is used in that way, I think it helps us understand why, for many people, it's a very negative thing. If it's seen as artificial, manipulative, and divorced from social actions and core principles. One of the ways that conservatives have co-opted or taken control of the word, not control, that's a bit of an overstatement, but used it effectively, we can say that much. There are certain strategies that we've seen over the last 5 to 10 years, as it relates to woke as an example, of how to take a word and completely destroy it. Not a word for the word's sake, but a concept, something meaningful. And that's what's happened to woke. It has completely lost its meaning in public discourse for most people. Maybe not for you, but for most people. So when you hear things in the media like the woke movement, movement, really? How about woke bureaucrats? God forbid we'd have bureaucrats that had a social conscience. Why would we want that? That could be a disaster. Or how about just wokeness? Again, language. One of my favorites is a mind virus. Be careful, because if you get too woke, it's going to really mess with your brain. That's not a good thing. Or how about woke idiots? That's gentle, isn't it? Can you be too woke? In public discourse, yes. It's really a bad thing to be too woke. You're just losing it. Or, to sum it all up, how about the cult of woke? Cult? Religion? Movement? I mean, you see what's happened to the word? How far is it from social consciousness, awareness of the world around you, to a cult? Does anybody know how to put a positive spin on the word cult? I don't think I could do that. I wouldn't want to try. But it's a great example of how words, concepts, ideas in our political environment have become weaponized. And that word weaponization, going back to dictionary definitions, weaponization means turning something into a weapon intended to kill. So weaponization is a very powerful term, and we know that it can be biological, it can be atomic, it can be any number of things designed for that purpose, even a bacteria. But now it's used metaphorically. So now the weaponization is not so much in a war context of killing people, it's become a weapon for destroying ideas, destroying concepts. And when you see or hear or read that our judiciary and our federal government has become too woke, and if you buy into this idea of the dangers of woke, some extremist groups have used the term woke to actually incite physical violence, which is really hard for me to understand, because to go from the world of ideas and concepts to physical action, to actual violence, is a long way to go. So it went from being a virtue to being pejorative or negative or judgmental to becoming, in some people's minds, something really dangerous, something to fear. So that's what I mean about weaponization. Some of the strategies that have been employed very successfully, and I'm sure you've heard some of the critics who say, why can't the Democrats be just as clever and crafty and manipulative and distortion and able to distort things as the Republicans? Well, that's kind of like race to the bottom, isn't it? I understand the rationale for that to a certain extent, but by the same token, I'm thinking, well, at what point do you become that? That to which you do not aspire. So it's really challenging in my mind to look at these effective strategies and how negative they are, and try to imagine, could those strategies be used for positive things? I haven't quite figured that out. But when I say strategies, what I mean is politicians, consultants, experts of whatever type have very effectively figured out how to weaponize words. And the first step is to overuse it. How many times in the last 4 years have you heard the word woke? And in how many of those cases did it mean the same thing yesterday as it sounded like today? It gets used in the most bizarre scenarios, in totally unrelated contexts. And so the more you use it, the less meaning it has. Because meaning comes back to context, doesn't it? What's the topic? What's the subject? What are we really talking about here? How does this word woke fit into this sentence, if anybody knows what a sentence is anymore? But not present company included. But it's amazing how many different people, commentators, politicians, consultants, use the word in totally unrelated ways. So it's a very effective strategy to strip the word of any meaningful value. It just loses its meaning. So therefore, if it has no meaning, you get to use it however you want, right? And if you know it upsets people, use it even more. And that's what's happened. So if it's divorced from meaning, divorced from context, then the listener gets to create whatever meaning he or she chooses. You see how dangerous that is? So it's not just that the speaker or the pundit or the politician is manipulating people. It's an effective strategy to get you to react emotionally to something you do not understand. But does that matter? If I can control your behavior by inciting fear, I don't really care what the word means. And I don't really need to say anything. All I have to do is say the woke bureaucrats. Get them out of the government. Implications and inferences are really not relevant. If you strip the word of meaning, if you overuse it, if you misuse it, misapply it, then as a presenter of ideas, you're not responsible in any way for what inferences people make from the misuse of the word. So it kind of makes the speaker blameless in a way. Isn't that ironic? It's an effective manipulative tool, but it's done in such a way that you can't really blame the person, because I don't need to know what it means just to be able to use the word. That's your problem. You figure out what it means. Just don't ask me. Which, by the way, if you're a YouTube fan, when I need something really light and fun to do, I go online and I look up woke. And you can see the most bizarre speakers using the word woke. I mean, it's sad and it's funny and happy at the same time. But it's just almost incomprehensible to see those videos of people actually using the word in the most bizarre imaginable ways. It really is almost incomprehensible. But it becomes an effective weapon when it's totally perceived as negative. So if the negative connections are so pervasive because of the overuse and the misuse, then it becomes a very useful tool to motivate people, to scare people, to try to get them to associate their fear reaction to whomever or whatever the topic might be. So, as I said before, it's an effective tool for killing ideas, for creating fear, for manipulating people without being perceived as a manipulator. To me, that's the really powerful thing about it. It can be used to manipulate without obviously appearing to be manipulative in your speech or your thoughts. Another really powerful example is CRT, critical race theory. The same process, a concept which originated in an academic discipline, which was never taught. I mean, I don't know how many academics there are in this room, but you don't really teach theories of any kind. You probe, you question, you experiment. But a theory is not a static thing that you can teach. It's not like the concept of gravity. Theories are, by their nature, like language, constantly evolving. So the idea of just teaching any kind of theory doesn't really make a lot of sense in the academic world. And race, by the way, if you've been in part of some of my other talks, race doesn't exist. It's just another concept that's useful as a tool. Scientifically, sociologically, it has absolutely no meaning, but it's still a useful tool, useful term. And critical, by the way, critical means being negative about something, right? Not in this context. In this context, it means very important. That's all it means. So critical means it's important. Race means something we need to watch out for because it's not real, even though we talk about it. And theory means don't worry about it. It's just one of those things that's going to be around and evolve. So all of a sudden, no, not all of a sudden, it's a gradual process, but critical race theory has become the boogeyman. How many times have you heard that term? And does it ever mean the same thing at the same? It's just kicked around like woke, and it's become a very useful tool to put people on guard, to make them worry about something that doesn't exist. So basically, what people are able to do with this weaponization process is to get credit for getting the boogeyman out of your closet, even though there's no boogeyman and no closet. But you get lots of credit for that. And that's exactly what's happening. I'm going to give myself credit for tamping down critical race theory, even though it's not being taught and it's not an issue. But making an issue out of nothing is a dimension of weaponization. Weaponizing not just words, but concepts and ideas. So it's become an intentional power play to undermine change and to perpetuate injustice. Isn't that a little disturbing? In the beginning, what did we say it was? Social consciousness. And now that word is used to perpetuate injustice, which is exactly the opposite of where we started. It's also used to disparage the oppressed and to protect the privileged. The purpose of the weaponization of woke is to stop change. To put it as directly as I possibly can. It's used often to put fear into the minds of voters that being woke is promoting too much change, and it's really deep down underneath anti-white. In a way, those things are pretty close, aren't they? White supremacy, anti-white supremacy. But just bring up the term white supremacy, did we just come across another weaponized word? It pushes people's buttons, literally. And it makes it very difficult to have a conversation with people when these weaponized terms are used in a discussion. Partly because no two people are going to have the same definition. Just because you don't understand something doesn't mean you're not emotional about it, right? Sure. That has always concerned me as an educator. And it's just one of the many things I could go on about with language and the sufferings that I go through. But one of them is, how many times do people say, I feel instead of I think? I don't really care too much about how you feel, but I'm very interested in how you think, if you do. But that's the new normal now. We don't think about things, we feel things, and therefore I'm going to share with you how I feel about this, but what I really would rather hear about is what are you thinking about this? That may sound like wordplay and trivial, but there's a lot more to it than just words. And that's where we are. That's where we are with weaponization of words. And again, I say it's much more than a word. It's a concept. It's a cluster of concepts. It's a cluster of emotions that's carried by that one little word. So the reason I gave this talk, I've given it several times now to different audiences, going back several months, but one of the reasons I'm so passionate about it is because of the election cycle that we're in. And to be informed voters, I think it's really important to understand what weaponization means, how it happens, and how to spot it. Because things can be used, you can miss points, ideas, concepts from any direction if you're not aware of how this works. So that to me is the point. It's about being an informed citizen and an informed voter. Any other examples of weaponization or any comments or questions you might have? DEI.
What is that? Diversity, equality, and inclusiveness.
Yeah. Diversity, equality, and inclusiveness are under the umbrella of woke, or woke is under the umbrella of DEI, but it's that same strategy of we don't want too much change. We don't want to lose privileges. We don't want things to get out of our control. Now, if you have control, that's very logical, right? But if you've never had control, then change is really a pretty good idea. Yes?
That's like also intersectionality. Is there a correlation time-wise about the changing of woke and the realization that whites will be the minority in this country? Because that happened about 10 years ago, too.
Yeah, that's a very good point. She's asking about two things: intersectionality, which is a very important concept, and the white majority / becoming a minority. And those two trends are very much related. And one of the reasons that it really, really annoys me when I hear white people say, what's going to happen when we're not the majority anymore? We're going to lose our privileges. Well, guess what? It's never been about numbers. How many Romans were there compared to the rest of the Roman Empire? They were a tiny minority. But did that mean that they didn't have power? So, I mean, we could go to 80-20 and whites would still have power. I mean, seriously. If you look at the dynamics of governance and power and privilege, it's not about 51%, oh my God, the sky is falling. So it's another non-issue, but it's very effective. It can rile people up because of this false perception that somehow it's all about the numbers. It's never been about the numbers.
That was about 10 years ago. Though.
Yeah, and that became very prominent. And then in the next 10 years, it's going to become more important because that's when it's going to kick in and be real. Now, there are many communities in the United States right now, states and cities, where it's already way past 50%
yeah.
in the wrong direction. Right? And I'm glad you brought up intersectionality. This is another kind of a buzzword or buzz concept. And it comes from primarily from researchers, minority researchers. And it's kind of a trap door, if you will, for liberals, where they talk about, women have made progress in X, Y, or Z, or blacks are so much better off because of A, B, or C. Well, the problem about women doing anything or getting anything is that, guess what? There's a lot of different kinds of women, There's old, there's young, there's black, there's white, there's red. And so intersectionality is due respect for the differences and the similarity. It's very annoying, for example, when you ask a black population if things are better than they were 50 years ago, and then you ask a white population if things are better for blacks than they were 50 years ago, you're going to get different answers. And if you ask educated blacks versus uneducated, employed versus unemployed, women who are in professions, women who are raising children, if you break women down to all these different categories, then you can put women with college educated. So then the circle becomes college educated. It's not women anymore. So intersectionality is a very healthy thing because it helps us avoid overgeneralizing, oversimplifying, and ignoring the reality that different people face. So thank you for bringing that up. Yes?
It seems to me that language has become much more interpretable in a variety of ways since the Trump administration started and alternate truths were introduced. No, seriously. It feels like it's just like Trump dropped a bomb. He was a bomb. It just blew a lot of things up, the whole thing of repetition now.
Yeah, her comment is very important. She said that, what about the way Trump uses language, and what about the fact that language is so imprecise now? And that's a part of this process, where you can use words in totally inappropriate ways, but if you keep using them, then people say, well, maybe I need to figure that out. No, you don't. It's not right. That's not a real word. Don't go there. But we feel this pressure because of the dynamics of social change and linguistic change. Sometimes we kind of feel like we need to keep up. Well, yeah, but let's not keep up with the wrong things. Let's keep up with the right things. But that's exactly it about the angst I have, the suffering I have about what's happening in the English language, is because meaning is lost. Subtlety is lost. The ability to hold two different ideas in your head at one time. I mean, those are basic mental skills that help you navigate a complex world. And the media is not serving us well in providing context, providing meaning, providing a little bit of subtlety. Whatever happened to subtlety? It's not there anymore. But you're absolutely right. The part of this process over the last 8 years has been attributable to the way Trump, I won't say uses language, I'd rather say misuses language. Yes?
Yes, just piggybacking on what she said, it's the whole language of alternative facts. Never in my life had I heard alternative facts before, but it became kind of a mainstay for a while.
The idea of alternative facts is meaningful in a science context. Some people want science to be absolute, like God is absolute. It doesn't work that way. So alternative facts in a political context is totally meaningless. I mean, by definition, by context, any measurable intellectual process would lead you to the conclusion that alternative facts is totally without merit as a concept. Doesn't matter, does it? It's still out there. And here again, you see how many times it's been used? So all of a sudden we get used to it. We kind of laugh, we kind of chuckle, but it's like a virus. That's a real, woke is not the virus, it's alternative facts is a real virus because it takes us away from what the words really mean. What does this concept really signify? Why is this such an absurd thing to say? And the more it's used, the less absurd it becomes, and the more susceptible we become to accepting it. Yes?
I'm just wondering, this might be really oversimplification on my part, but hasn't the word liberal just been totally weaponized?
Yes.
I mean, I always think of liberal as someone who's open-minded, and I still do. But it is. I feel it's disturbing to me.
Yeah. Her comment was, hasn't liberal become weaponized?
Yes.
And I would say, obviously, yes. But have you noticed that conservative has also become weaponized?
The same
Well,
thing.
I remember a time in my life when I could respect conservative perspectives, conservative people. I could see the benefits of conservatives and liberals collaborating in a political context. David Brooks is one of the last holdouts, I think, of an intellectual Republican conservative for whom I have great respect. So I'm glad you brought that up, because this is a reminder for us that we can fall into this in our domain, just like we can see others using things in a manipulative way. So I think to engage people, and part of my mission as an educator, retired educator, what they say about educators. They don't really retire, they just lose their class. So that's where I am. I just lost it. But this is a very good example of how careful we have to be. When we see somebody labeled as a conservative, this is not the right response. Let them talk, find out, because they're not all crazy. And not all liberals are smart.
But conservatives haven't run away from the term. Liberals, we used to be proud to call ourselves liberal. It got weaponized, and so we said, we don't call ourselves liberals anymore, we call ourselves progressive. And I'm not going to walk away from any more terms.
Yeah. Yeah, his comment was the conservatives have kind of settled in and defended like in a battle scene. I hate to use too many war metaphors, but they've kind of locked in on that, and liberals, some, kind of run away from it. And it's because the Republicans have been more effective at weaponizing words and terms than the Democrats. So what you're pointing out is very much relevant to this topic. And I don't know how much of it's media, how much of it's savvy, how much of it's strategy. I couldn't say that. But the fact that it's still okay to say you're a conservative in many circles, but less okay to say that you're a liberal, talks about the differentiation in terms of how effective the weaponization strategy has been. Yes, sir.
In what's going on in the Middle East today, the term anti-Semitic pops up. And most people think of anti-Semitic as being anti-Jewish, whereas the word Semitic refers to language.
It's a great example.
Yeah.
It's a great example. And it points out how thin our knowledge is. And I attribute a lot of that concern to media. The fact that we know so little about so much. I remember when I was being trained as an educator, I was warned that when you get into the classroom, you have to make decisions. Do you want a narrow path and go really deep and really get down to the bottom of things and really teach your students to really understand the complexity of things? Or do you want a broad swath, very shallow? And that's what the media does. It gives us tidbits and very little knowledge. It's like the difference between information and knowledge. Are those the same?
Yeah.
No. Information and knowledge is totally different. And my grandson is a great example of that. He knows a little bit about 1,000 things and doesn't understand anything. I'm sorry. He listens to the news. He can chat with me about this and that. But if you ask him what we would used to call in the classroom a comprehension question, blank. But I've really followed this closely, and it's a very disturbing example of poor language, poor understanding, poor representation. Somehow, this is really kind of bizarre when you think about it, somehow acknowledging what's happening to the Palestinians is automatically anti-Semitic. One of the things that I learned in Latin America in my years there is that in that culture, and in many parts of the world, people are crystal clear about the difference between people and government. We don't get that. If you get around the world and talk to people, you'll notice that right away. I was in Nicaragua during the Counter-Revolutionary War, and I was the representative of the American school to the government, and I met with the Minister of Education the day after the Contras killed his brother.
Oh my Lord.
He did not hold that against me for a minute, because he was crystal clear in his thinking, not his feeling. But his thinking, you are not the U.S. government.
Right.
We don't get that. We being, the public sphere. So to be anti-Israeli government, because what the government is doing, is that the same thing as being anti-Jewish people? How do you go there?
Right.
But that's what the media serves us. And so all these demonstrations, all these college campuses are anti-Semitic because we're right back with woke, aren't we?
Yeah.
Are there injustices being perpetuated on both sides?
Yes.
How could you say no to that question? We know with certainty that there's injustice on both sides. So whichever place you choose to look, are you making an effort not to look over here? I mean, it sounds simple, but one of the things that our education system has failed to do, and this really pains me, is to teach people, to have them experience the idea of holding two contradictory ideas in their head at the same time and grappling with that. The world is gray. It's not black and white. But if you were from another planet and you looked at the media here, wouldn't you have to conclude that the world is definitely black or white?
too. I mean, we're trying to tell teachers what to do in the classroom. Stay out of it. Let the educators know. That's what they went to school for.
Yeah, well, that's a very sore topic for me. You really hit a nerve, because I don't know how many people would walk into a hospital and say, stop doing this kind of surgery. Can you picture that?
Well, they're already.
Well, okay.
I want to take that back.
Yeah, I'm going to rewind that one, and you're going to take that out of the tape. But seriously, there are so many professions where, I mean, would you walk into a lawyer's office and say, you have no idea what you're doing. Let me tell you how to try my case. A sane person wouldn't do that, right? But somehow in education, since we were all kids once, and we were all in school once, we're all experts on school, right? I mean, it doesn't work that way. But it is true that a dimension. So the book banning is a manifestation of the weaponization of woke.
Just
See,
like with COVID. COVID was hit.
it was weaponized.
You have nurses in positions that they don't want to be in that.
That's right. And the other thing that the well, you guys are a challenging audience. The other thing that the pandemic did was showed us how little we understood science.
Yes.
Science is not about answers. Science is about questions. Asking the right questions is what a good scientist does. As soon as the scientist says, I know the answer, step back. Are we out of time? I could go on forever, obviously.
And the questions could go on forever. Very, very informative. Thank you. Thanks again so much, Mr. Wegener. Everybody, have a good weekend, and thank you all.